On November 3, 1874, at the tunnel camp above Blue Canyon, a 22-year-old woman named Su Ling was handed over to settle her dead father's debt to a labor contractor, the only thing of value he had left behind, besides a jade pendant and a chest of dried roots. The contractor who owned her paper sold the paper itself, not the woman, to the foreman running the powder crews at Camp 9, a man named Ezra Doyle who had not asked her name before he signed for her, only whether she could cook for 40 men and keep a ledger straight. Doyle held the only thing that mattered in that canyon, her contract, her wage, and the tent she would sleep in until the debt was called even. Everyone at Camp 9 expected him to work her like a mule through the granite dust for 2 years and forget her face the day the paper expired. That was what happened to every contracted woman who came up the grade behind the Central Pacific. What Doyle did instead, before the ink on the transfer paper had dried, was ask the Chinese foreman standing beside him how to say her name correctly, and he said it wrong twice before he got it right, and did not stop trying until he had. The camp clerk laughed at him for it. Su Ling did not laugh. She had spent 3 weeks being sold like a crate of blasting powder, weighed and priced and passed hand to hand down the grade from Sacramento, and no man in that chain had asked her anything at all. She watched Doyle fold the transfer paper into his coat without reading the terms twice, the way men did when they meant to hold a person to the letter of a debt, and she braced for the 2 years the paper promised. The tunnel behind him breathed cold air into the canyon. A mouth cut halfway through the mountain and stalled for 6 weeks because the last 3 powder men had misjudged the rock and lost fingers, an arm, and once a life to a charge that went wrong. Nobody at Camp 9 had told her that part of the contract. She would learn it from the silence at supper, and from the specific way the men flinched when the whistle blew for a blast, and she would carry both the silence and the cold room over the tunnel's failure long before anyone thought to explain either one to her out loud. Doyle walked her past the cook tent and the assay shack without a word of welcome, past the row of Chinese laborers who set down their tools to watch the transaction complete itself, and stopped at a narrow tent set apart from the others near the tunnel supply depot. He told her, through the foreman who translated in flat, careful English, that she would keep the powder ledger, cook for the blast crews, and stay clear of the tunnel face itself, because a woman near a live charge was bad luck the men would not work around. Su Ling said nothing. She had heard worse superstitions dressed as reason before, in the labor camps outside Sacramento, and she had learned that arguing with a man's fear cost more than it ever earned back. She set her chest of roots inside the tent, the same chest her mother had packed with dried angelica and ginseng and a strip of red cloth from a wedding that never happened, and she understood, cataloging the tent's thin walls and the wind coming down off the ridge, that Camp 9 expected her to last exactly as long as the debt required, and not 1 season more. The men outside were already placing bets, low and murmured, on whether the tunnel would open before the woman broke or the woman would leave before the tunnel opened, and either way the smart money did not favor her. That first night she walked the length of the camp alone after the cook fires had banked low, counting tents the way her father had taught her to count grain sacks, by twos and by the gaps where a count went missing. She found the powder shed unlocked, and the ledger inside it kept in a hand, so careless that a crate of 50 had been logged as 40, a discrepancy nobody in the camp seemed to have noticed or cared to notice, the kind of error that got men killed underground when a charge came up short of what the log promised. She did not touch the ledger that night. She only stood in the cold with her hand on the shed's rough door and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have been sold more than once, that the tunnel's failures were not bad luck at all, and that the camp's fear of her presence near the blast face was going to have to answer, eventually, to whatever she found written in that book. Somewhere up the ridge a wolf called and went unanswered, and Su Ling turned back toward her tent already rehearsing, in a language she was still learning to trust her own mouth to shape, the sentence she would need when someone finally asked her what she knew. The morning after she arrived, Su Ling rose before the cook fires were lit and walked the camp in the gray dark, memorizing its shape the way she had once memorized the shape of her family's fields before the flood took them. Camp 9 sat in a fold of the Sierra where the Central Pacific's grade climbed toward the summit tunnels, a scattering of canvas and rough timber pressed between granite walls that held the cold like a fist. She counted 41 tents, 3 cook fires, 1 assay scale locked behind the company store, and a tunnel mouth braced with fresh-cut timber that still wept sap in the cold. The men who worked the blast crews were mostly her own countrymen, brought up from Sacramento and San Francisco on contracts not unlike her own, though theirs were measured in coin and hers in a dead man's silence. She found the cook tent by its smell before she found it by sight, wood smoke and old grease, and the particular sourness of beans cooked too long in water that had not been changed. The woman who had run the kitchen before her, an older widow named Auntie Feng, handed her the ladle without ceremony and said only that the men ate what was given, and complained regardless, so there was no use trying to please them, only to feed them enough that they could swing a sledge until dusk. Su Ling took the ladle and understood it as the first thing in the camp that had been handed to her rather than sold, and she held on to that distinction even as her hands, unused to a ladle that size, ached by the second hour. She fed 40 men that morning on beans and hardtack and a broth she thinned with wild onion she had gathered herself before dawn, and when Doyle came through the line last, he ate without comment, the way he did everything, and left a coin on the board that she was fairly sure was not required and had not been left by any other man in the line. She did not know yet what to make of him, this foreman who had learned her name before he had learned anything else about her, who spoke to the Chinese crew bosses in a clipped respect she had not expected from a company man, and who had not once, in the hours since the transfer paper changed hands, looked at her the way the labor contractor in Sacramento had, like a line item awaiting settlement. That afternoon she found her way to the powder shed again, this time with a legitimate excuse, Auntie Feng having told her the ledger needed a second set of eyes since the last clerk had gone home to Boston with a bad lung. She opened the book properly in daylight and confirmed what she had suspected in the dark. 50 crates counted as 40, a full 10 crates of blasting powder unaccounted for in a tunnel already 6 weeks behind schedule, and short 2 fingers and an arm for its trouble. She did not report it. She copied the true count onto a scrap of paper in her own hand, folded it into the lining of her sleeve beside the strip of red wedding cloth, and closed the ledger exactly as she had found it, because a woman who had been sold twice in one season had learned that information was worth more held than spent, and that the moment to spend it had not yet arrived. The tunnel crew's foreman under Doyle was a broad Cornishman named Tam Rourke, who had blasted rock in 3 countries and trusted none of the Chinese powder counts, a habit Su Ling learned about only because he said so, loudly, in the mess line on her 4th day, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. He said the tunnel was cursed, that the mountain did not want opening, that they had lost a man to a charge that fired early and another to one that did not fire at all until a full hour after the crew thought it dead, which was worse, because a man walked back in to clear a stall and the mountain took him anyway. Su Ling listened from behind the serving board and said nothing, though she had by then read enough of the ledger's careless hand to suspect the mountain had very little to do with either death. Powder that sat too long in damp storage lost its reliability in ways a careless clerk's arithmetic would never catch, and a shed with 10 missing crates and a leaking roof, which she had also noted on her second visit, was exactly the kind of place that produced both a charge that fired too fast and one that refused to fire at all. She was not yet permitted near the tunnel face, a rule Doyle enforced without explanation beyond a single sentence, spoken not unkindly, that the men were frightened enough without a reason to blame someone new. She accepted the rule the way she accepted the cold, as a condition of the place rather than a judgment on her, and turned her attention instead to the powder shed's roof, which she patched herself over 2 evenings with tar paper scavenged from a supply crate nobody had claimed, working by lantern light after the ladle was clean and the ledger was closed. Doyle found her on the roof the second evening, balanced on the ridge beam with tar paper and a hammer she had borrowed without asking, and instead of ordering her down, which she had braced for, he climbed up the far side and held the paper flat while she nailed it, and they worked in a silence that was not the silence of the mess tent, not the silence of a debt owed, but something closer to 2 people agreeing without language that a leaking roof over gunpowder was a problem worth solving before it was worth explaining. When the paper was nailed and the roof no longer wept onto the crates below, Doyle asked her, through gestures more than words, how she had known to fix it, and she answered by pointing first at the water stain on the powder crates and then at the sky, and he nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he has learned something he did not expect to learn from the person he had least expected to teach him, and neither of them said anything more that night, though the silence between them had changed its shape entirely. Winter came to the grade early that year, the way it always did above 5,000 feet, and the camp's rhythm changed with it, the blast crews working shorter days as the snow deepened and the powder shed's dryness became a matter of survival rather than housekeeping. Su Ling's English, which had been a thin scaffold of transaction words when she arrived, had begun to thicken with use, not from any lesson but from necessity, from ordering supplies at the company store and negotiating with a mule packer over the price of salt pork, and, more than either of those, from the accumulating hours beside Doyle, who had taken to walking the camp perimeter each evening at the same hour she carried scraps to the camp's half-tame dog, so that their paths crossed with a regularity neither of them named. He asked her, one such evening, haltingly and with more patience than she had seen him extend to any other person in the camp, about the pendant she wore, and she told him, in the fractured English she had by then assembled, that it had belonged to her grandmother, and that jade was carried by women in her family the way some men here carried a photograph, as a piece of a place too far away to visit, and too important to leave behind entirely. Doyle listened to the whole halting explanation without interrupting to correct her grammar, a courtesy she noticed precisely because every other man in the camp corrected her constantly, as though her English were a target rather than a bridge still under construction. He told her, in exchange, that his own family had lost a farm in Ohio to a banknote not so different from the debt that had brought her here, and that he understood something of what it meant to be handed from one ledger to another without much say in the matter. It was the first time since Sacramento that anyone had offered her a piece of themselves without first taking something in return, and she carried the exchange back to her tent that night, turning it over like a coin whose value she had not yet determined. The camp, meanwhile, had begun to notice the pattern of their evening walks, and Tam Rourke made a comment in the mess line, loud enough for her to hear, about foremen who forgot which side of a ledger they were supposed to stand on, and Doyle, for the first time since she had known him, answered a provocation in front of the whole crew, saying only that the powder shed had not leaked once since she patched it, and the tunnel had not lost a man since either, and that a foreman who could not tell the difference between superstition and a dry roof had no business running a blast crew. The mess tent went quiet in a way it had not gone quiet before, and Su Ling understood that something had shifted publicly that could not be walked back privately, though what it would cost either of them she did not yet know. The company man arrived on the second week of December, a sharp-suited assayer's clerk from the district office named Whit Cassell, who came up the grade ostensibly to audit the powder consumption against the tunnel's slow progress, though Su Ling understood within an hour of his arrival that his real purpose was to find fault with Doyle's management and, failing that, with anything else the camp could be made to answer for. Cassell took one look at the cook tent's ledger, which Su Ling had kept in a hand far more precise than her predecessors, and asked, in a tone that assumed the answer would embarrass someone who had taught a Chinese woman to keep company books. She told him, evenly, that her father had kept accounts for a rice merchant in Guangdong before the flood took the business and then took him, and that numbers behaved the same in any language. Cassell did not appear to hear the answer so much as file it away as an irregularity to report upward, and he moved next to the powder shed, where he intended, he announced to Doyle in front of the assembled crew bosses, to conduct a full inventory against the company's shipping manifests. Su Ling felt the folded scrap of paper in her sleeve lining, as though it had grown heavier overnight, the true count she had kept private for 6 weeks now, standing between a company auditor and a discrepancy of 10 crates that could be blamed, if the timing fell wrong, on exactly the kind of person the camp already suspected of being unlucky near explosives. She said nothing while Cassell counted, watching his tally climb toward the same false total the careless clerk had logged in Boston, and she understood that she held, in that one folded scrap of paper, the power to correct a public record in a direction that would either vindicate her or condemn her, depending entirely on who the missing 10 crates were eventually found to implicate. Doyle caught her eye once across the shed, a question he could not ask aloud with Cassell present, and she answered it with the smallest shake of her head. Not yet, not here, not until she understood exactly where those 10 crates had gone, and whether the answer pointed at carelessness or at something a great deal more deliberate, that the whole camp, blast crew and company man alike, was about to find considerably harder to ignore. It took Su Ling 4 more days to trace the 10 missing crates, and she did it the way her father had traced a bad debt through a rice merchant's books, not by asking questions, but by matching dates against a second, smaller ledger she found tucked behind a loose board in the company store, kept in the same careless hand as the Boston clerk's, but recording sales that appeared nowhere in the official manifest. The store's keeper, a heavyset man named Grissom who sold at prices the camp had no choice but to pay, had been skimming powder from the tunnel's supply and selling it quietly to a placer claim 2 miles down canyon that could not get its own shipments through before the passes closed, a business arrangement that had nothing to do with the tunnel's bad luck and everything to do with a man deciding that a mountain full of desperate miners was worth more to him diverted than delivered whole. She brought what she had found to Doyle in the powder shed at an hour when the crews were at supper, laying the second ledger and her own scrap of true counts side by side on a crate lid, and watched his face move through disbelief and then a controlled, dangerous quiet she had not seen from him before. He asked her carefully why she had not brought this to him the moment Cassell arrived, and she told him the truth, that a woman who accused a white storekeeper of theft with no proof but her own arithmetic would have been the one sent off the grade by morning, and that she had needed the second ledger in Grissom's own hand before her word would carry any weight at all against his. Doyle did not argue the point, which told her more about how the camp actually worked than any speech could have. He asked instead what she thought should happen next, a question no man in her life had asked her before making a decision that affected her, and she told him plainly that Cassell should see both ledgers together, in front of witnesses, before Grissom had time to burn the second book or blame its contents on the tunnel crew. They walked to the company store together that evening, the 2 ledgers wrapped in oilcloth against the snow, and the crew bosses who saw them pass fell into step behind them without being asked, an escort neither Doyle nor Su Ling had requested, but neither turned away either, because the camp, whatever it believed about luck and blame, understood the shape of an accounting finally coming due. Grissom denied it first with bluster, and then, when Cassell himself compared the 2 ledgers' handwriting under a lantern and found them unmistakably the same hand as the store's own receipt book, with a silence that convicted him more thoroughly than any confession could have. Castle, to his credit or perhaps only to the credit of his own career, which would not survive endorsing a theft he had failed to catch, turned on Grissom with the same cold efficiency he had turned on Su Ling 4 days earlier, though this time the crew bosses watching did not need to be told which direction the blame now properly ran. Doyle said little through the confrontation, standing at Su Ling's shoulder rather than in front of her, a positioning she noted and understood as its own kind of statement in a camp where men were accustomed to speaking over the women who fed them. When Castle finally asked, almost as an afterthought, how the discrepancy had first been noticed, Doyle answered before Su Ling could decide whether to answer at all, saying plainly that his cook kept the tightest ledger he had seen on the whole grade, and that the camp owed her for catching what a company auditor with a full manifest in hand had missed on his first pass through the shed. The words landed in the crowded store with a weight Su Ling felt in her chest before she understood why, because it was the first time since the flood took her father that a man had credited her publicly, by name and by skill, in front of people whose good opinion controlled whether she could stay through the winter or be judged, on some pretext, unsuitable for the camp entirely. Grissom was gone by the next supply wagon, his store handed over to a clerk from the district office, and the tunnel crew's powder allotment corrected within the week, a resolution that should have settled the matter entirely, except that it did not, because a camp that had just watched a Chinese cook expose a white storekeeper's theft did not, as a whole, receive the lesson the way Doyle or Su Ling might have hoped. Some men nodded to her in the mess line now who had not nodded before. Others, Tam Rourke chief among them, grew quieter in a way that was not agreement but calculation, and Su Ling, who had learned to read a room the way she read a ledger, understood that she had traded one kind of danger, the danger of being overlooked, for another kind entirely, the danger of being resented for having mattered. The resentment found its shape 3 weeks later, when a fresh snow closed the lower pass and the camp's supply wagon failed to arrive on schedule, leaving Camp 9 short on flour and salt pork with no relief expected for at least 10 days. Rourke stood in the mess line that first short-rationed morning and said, to the men around him rather than to Su Ling directly, that a camp cook who spent her time playing bookkeeper instead of stretching what stores they had was the reason they would all go hungry before the wagon came, a charge that ignored entirely that the shortfall had nothing to do with Su Ling, and everything to do with a mountain pass and a storekeeper's greed already resolved. Su Ling did not answer him in the mess line. She answered him instead over the following days by doing precisely what her mother and her grandmother had done through 2 famines she had only heard described in careful, spare language around a family table, stretching a thin store of grain and dried root into a broth that filled a man's stomach on far less than he expected to need. Supplementing it with wild onion and miner's lettuce she dug from beneath the snow in places she alone seemed to know to look, and with a preparation of the dried herbs from her mother's chest, ground fine and stirred through the broth, that settled a hungry man's stomach in a way plain water and beans never had. By the fourth day of short rations, the camp was eating better than it had any right to expect, and by the sixth day, even Rourke ate his portion without complaint, though he did not thank her for it, which she had not expected and did not require. Doyle noticed what she had done in a way that went beyond simple gratitude, watching her grind the dried roots each evening with the same attention he had once given the powder shed's leaking roof, and on the seventh night of short rations he asked her, in English that had grown more careful and more patient with every week he spent listening to hers improve, whether the herbs she used were medicine as much as food. And she told him yes, that her grandmother had been the closest thing to a doctor her village possessed, and that she herself had learned enough to treat a fever, set a simple break, and stop a wound from turning bad. Knowledge she had never once been asked about since arriving at Camp 9, because nobody had thought to wonder what a contracted cook might know beyond a ladle. Doyle absorbed this information the way he absorbed everything of consequence, quietly, and said only that the camp's doctor was a 3-day ride down the grade in good weather and considerably longer in bad, a fact Su Ling filed away without comment, sensing that the mountain, sooner or later, would test whether that particular gap mattered as much as she suspected it might. The test came on the 9th day of short rations, not from hunger but from the mountain itself, when a rock fall inside the tunnel's newest heading caught 2 men before the shoring could be reset, burying one to the waist and opening a gash along the other's scalp deep enough that the camp's usual response, a strip of clean cloth and whiskey to dull the pain, was plainly inadequate to the wound. The injured man's crewmates carried him to the mess tent because it was the nearest warm shelter, not because anyone had decided Su Ling should treat him, and she was already kneeling beside him with clean water boiling before Doyle arrived at a run from the tunnel mouth, having left the buried man to 4 others digging him free while he came to find out whether the camp had anything better to offer the bleeding one than whiskey and hope. Su Ling worked the way her grandmother had taught her, cleaning the wound before she touched it with anything else, packing it with a paste ground from herbs she had carried across an ocean for exactly this kind of use, though she had never expected to need them on a stranger's skull in a mining camp mess tent, and binding it with a wrapped pressure that stopped the worst of the bleeding within minutes, rather than the hour or more the camp's usual methods generally required. Doyle stood over her shoulder saying nothing, watching hands that had ground root and kept ledgers now moving with the same unhurried precision over a man's open scalp. And when the bleeding slowed and the injured man's breathing steadied from panic into something closer to exhausted relief, Doyle turned without a word and went back to the tunnel to help dig out the second man, trusting, in a way he had trusted no one else in the camp on a matter of life rather than powder counts, that the first man was now in better hands than his own. The second man came free an hour later with a broken leg and no worse, and by evening both men were resting in the mess tent under blankets Su Ling had arranged near the fire, the bound scalp already showing the clean, dry edges of a wound that would heal without the fever that so often followed a dirty binding. Word of what had happened moved through the camp faster than the rockfall itself had, and for the first time since Grissom's disgrace, Su Ling felt the balance of the camp's opinion tip in a direction that had nothing to do with resentment at all, though she understood, watching Rourke stand silent and unreadable at the mess tent's edge that evening, that not every man in Camp 9 was prepared to let a debt of gratitude outweigh whatever it was he had decided to hold against her from the beginning. What Rourke had decided to hold against her revealed itself slowly, over the following weeks, in the shape of a rumor that began circulating through the camp's edges rather than its center. A suggestion, never spoken directly to Su Ling or to Doyle, that the tunnel's bad luck had not ended with Grissom's arrest at all, and that a Chinese woman working so freely around a blast crew's supply, ledger and medicine alike, was inviting a reckoning the mountain had not yet delivered. Su Ling heard the rumor secondhand from Auntie Feng, who heard it from a laundry woman married to one of Rourke's crew, and traced it, without much difficulty, back to Rourke himself, who had never accepted Doyle's public defense of her competence so much as absorbed it and let it curdle into something quieter and more patient than open hostility. She did not bring the rumor to Doyle immediately, weighing, as she had weighed the missing powder crates, whether the telling would do more harm than the silence, until the rumor found its way into a decision that could no longer be ignored, when Rourke's crew, drawing the next heading assignment inside the tunnel, requested through the crew boss that the powder charges for their section be set and verified by someone other than the woman who kept the shed's ledger, on the stated grounds that a section already 6 weeks behind could not afford to test a theory about a cook's arithmetic against granite that did not forgive mistakes. Doyle refused the request outright, in front of the assembled crew bosses, stating that Su Ling's counts had been the most reliable thing in that shed since the day she arrived, and that no crew under his authority would set a charge on a count he had less confidence in, simply because the count came from a woman some of them resented, for reasons that had nothing to do with powder. The refusal did not end the matter so much as drive it underground, into the same quiet current that had carried the rumor in the first place. And Su Ling understood, watching Rourke's crew file into the tunnel the next morning without further comment, that she had been handed a victory that looked, from the outside, exactly like the beginning of a much longer and more dangerous argument. She returned to the powder shed that evening and went through the count twice more than her usual practice required, not because she doubted her own arithmetic, but because she understood, with a clarity that settled cold in her chest, that the next mistake in that tunnel, whoever caused it, was going to be laid at her door regardless of the truth, and that the only defense available to her was a record so precise that even Rourke's patient resentment would have nothing left to work with. The argument Rourke had driven underground surfaced again in late January, when the tunnel crew reached a stretch of rock unlike anything they had blasted through before, a seam of decomposed granite so unstable that a standard charge risked bringing down not just the heading, but a section of ceiling 30 feet back toward the portal, a danger the crew's own blasting foreman, consulted privately by Doyle, admitted he had never encountered on any grade he had worked in 3 countries. Su Ling, reviewing the shed's supply against the tunnel's geological reports, which Doyle had begun sharing with her without either of them remarking on the shift in practice, recognized the seam's description from an account her father had once translated for a mining concern outside Guangdong. Decomposed rock that behaved less like stone and more like packed sand, once disturbed, requiring a charge set shallow and slow rather than deep and sharp, spread across a wider face to distribute the shock, rather than concentrated to punch straight through. She brought the observation to Doyle carefully, aware that she was proposing to correct not a ledger, but the literal method of blasting a mountain, a suggestion that sat considerably further outside her sanctioned role than counting powder crates ever had. Doyle listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, asked her to repeat the part about spreading the charge across a wider face twice, and then did something that would become, in the retelling around Camp 9's fires for years afterward, the moment the whole grade understood exactly where he stood. He brought her to the tunnel face itself, past the rule that had kept her clear of the blast site since her first week, and asked her to explain the method directly to the blasting foreman and Rourke's own crew, in front of the men who had petitioned to keep her arithmetic away from their heading only weeks before. Rourke said nothing while she spoke, his arms crossed, his face unreadable in the lamplight, and when she finished, the blasting foreman, a cautious man named Petrov who had buried 2 friends to bad charges in his career and trusted caution over pride, said simply that he had heard of the method from a Cornish tin mine years ago and had never had reason to try it, and that he saw no reason not to try it now, given that the alternative was guessing against a mountain that did not forgive guesses. The decision to set the charge Su Ling's way in front of the entire tunnel crew was not Doyle's decision alone to make public, and she understood, standing in the cold tunnel air with every man's attention fixed on her for the first time since her arrival, that whatever happened when that charge fired would settle, one way or the other, far more than the fate of one stretch of unstable rock. The charge was set 2 days later, spread wide and shallow across the unstable face exactly as Su Ling had described, packed by Petrov's own hands under her quiet correction when his first attempt ran the powder too deep at the seam's western edge, a correction he accepted without the wounded pride Rourke would have shown in his place, because Petrov, whatever his other qualities, cared more for his own survival than for who had taught him to improve his odds of it. The whole crew withdrew to the portal's mouth to wait, a silence settling over Camp 9 that Su Ling had not felt since her first morning, when the whole camp had watched a transfer paper change hands and placed its private bets on how long she would last. Doyle stood beside her at the portal rather than with his crew bosses, a positioning the camp had stopped remarking on weeks earlier but that still carried its own quiet weight, and when the charge fired, a controlled, rolling concussion that shook dust from the timber shoring but brought down nothing beyond the intended face, The silence in the portal broke into something Su Ling had not heard directed at her before, a rough, unpolished cheer from men who had spent 2 months deciding whether to trust her and had, in the space of one blast, settled the question for themselves, rather than being told the answer. Petrov went in first once the dust cleared enough to breathe, and came back out grinning in a way his cautious face did not often allow, reporting that the seam had held exactly where they wanted it, and given nowhere it should not have. The cleanest heading, he said, that Camp 9 had cut since the tunnel began. Rourke did not cheer with the others. He stood at the portal's edge with his arms still crossed, watching Su Ling accept Petrov's rough congratulations with the same composed quiet she had carried since the transfer paper first changed hands in November. And when the celebration thinned and the crews returned to clearing the new heading, he approached her alone, the first time he had spoken to her directly since the mess line accusation over short rations, and said only, in a voice pitched low enough that it did not carry to Doyle a few yards off, that a woman who could read rock like that had no business in a cook tent, a sentence Su Ling turned over for the rest of that evening, uncertain whether it had been offered as an insult, a grudging compliment, or some uneasy mixture of both that even Rourke himself had not fully worked out before he said it. Whatever uneasy mixture Rourke had intended by his half-compliment did not soften the deeper current running beneath his resentment, which Su Ling understood within the week had less to do with powder or rock and more to do with a letter he had received from his sister in Cornwall describing a mine closure that had put half their family's village out of work. A closure the letter blamed, with the easy logic of distant grief, on cheap contracted labor undercutting honest wages, a category Rourke had apparently decided Su Ling belonged to regardless of the specific and considerable skill she had brought to a tunnel his own crew had failed to blast safely without her. She learned this from Doyle, who had learned it from Petrov, who had overheard Rourke reading the letter aloud to a sympathetic ear in the mess line, and she absorbed the information with a strange, unwanted sympathy for a man who had decided to hate her for a grief that predated her arrival at Camp 9 by months and an ocean. It did not make his hostility easier to bear, but it clarified its shape, and clarity, she had learned since November, was worth more to her than comfort in a place where comfort was rarely offered honestly. She raised the matter once with Doyle, not to ask him to intervene but because she wanted him to understand that Rourke's resentment was not simple ignorance but a specific, personal wound dressed in the language of camp superstition, and Doyle, listening with the same careful attention he gave every problem she brought him, said that understanding a man's wound did not obligate anyone to let him use it as a weapon, a distinction she filed away as one of the more useful things anyone had told her since the flood took her father. The winter deepened around this uneasy equilibrium, the tunnel crew advancing steadily now that the unstable seam had been passed, Su Ling's ledger keeping the powder shed honest, her herbs keeping the camp's small injuries from turning into larger ones, and Doyle's evening walks past her tent continuing with a regularity that had, by February, stopped being a secret from anyone in Camp 9, though neither of them had yet spoken the word that would have named what those walks had become, a silence that felt, to Su Ling, less like the silence of a debt and more like the deliberate quiet of two people choosing, each evening, to keep choosing each other without the pressure of having to say so aloud before either was ready. The sheriff came up the grade in the first week of March, not for Su Ling directly but for the camp generally, investigating a claim-jumping dispute at a placer site 2 miles down canyon, the same claim, Su Ling realized with a cold recognition. That Grissom had been quietly supplying with stolen powder before his arrest, a connection the sheriff, a heavy-set man named Boone Castellan, with a reputation the camp regarded with more wariness than respect, seemed determined to pursue, in whatever direction proved most convenient, to close his investigation quickly. Castellan's convenient direction, once he learned that Camp 9's cook kept the powder ledger and had been the one to expose Grissom's theft in the first place, became Su Ling herself, whom he questioned in the company store with an aggressive leading style that assumed guilt before it established fact, suggesting that a Chinese woman with access to blasting powder and a documented history of catching one white man's crime might well have arranged the whole affair to cover a scheme of her own. Doyle, present for the questioning at Su Ling's insistence rather than by any right Castellan had initially been inclined to grant him, interrupted twice to correct the timeline Castellan was attempting to construct, pointing out with barely restrained anger that Su Ling's ledger entries predated Grissom's arrest by weeks, and had been independently verified by the district office's own auditor. A fact Castellan could confirm with one telegram if he cared to, rather than continue building a theory that conveniently absolved a placer claims owner, a man named Duras, who Doyle noted, pointedly, was a personal friend of the sheriff's from before either man had come west. The accusation hung in the store's cold air regardless of Doyle's objections, because Castellan held, in that moment, exactly the kind of power the whole camp had expected some company man or lawman to eventually wield against her, the power to declare a contracted Chinese woman guilty of whatever crime proved most convenient, and have that declaration carry the weight of law in a canyon 3 days from the nearest court that might review it seriously. Su Ling stood through the accusation with the same composed stillness she had carried through every test since November, though inwardly she measured, for the first time since the transfer paper changed hands, how little her competence or her ledger or her medicine might matter against a sheriff determined to close a file quickly, and how entirely her fate in that moment rested on whether the camp around her, the same camp that had once bet on how fast she would break, would now stand behind her loudly enough to matter. The camp stood behind her, though not in the way Su Ling might have imagined months earlier, not with speeches or declarations, but with the accumulated, specific weight of testimony that Castellan could not easily dismiss. Petrov describing the tunnel seam she had correctly diagnosed when his own experience had failed him. The injured miner from January showing the sheriff a scalp scar healed clean and fast under her binding, Auntie Feng producing, unprompted, her own careful record of every meal stretched and every fever broken through the hard weeks of short rations, and even, to Su Ling's genuine surprise, Rourke, who stepped forward last and said, in a voice that cost him something visible to spend, that whatever else he thought of the arrangement at Camp 9, he had watched the woman set a charge that saved his crew's heading and had no cause to believe she would risk the same crew's safety for a theft scheme with a down canyon placer claim she had never once been seen to visit. It was not forgiveness, and Su Ling did not mistake it for warmth, but it was testimony freely given by a man who had every private reason to withhold it, and it carried a weight in that store that her own defense, however true, could never have carried alone. Castellan, faced with a wall of specific, corroborated testimony rather than the vague suspicion he had hoped to convert into a quick resolution, retreated from his accusation without quite apologizing for having made it, muttering something about following up leads and departing the following morning back down the grade toward the placer claim and, Doyle suspected aloud once the sheriff was well clear of the camp, toward whatever quieter arrangement he intended to reach with his friend Duras regarding the claim-jumping dispute that had brought him up the mountain in the first place. Su Ling watched the sheriff's party disappear around the canyon bend and felt something loosen in her chest that she had been carrying, she realized only in its absence, since the moment Castellan first said her name in that accusing tone in the company store. Doyle found her still standing at the camp's edge an hour later, the cold well past uncomfortable, and said nothing about the sheriff at all, only that supper was getting cold and that Auntie Feng had been asking after her, an ordinary, almost domestic concern that struck Su Ling, in that particular moment, as more moving than any grand declaration could have been, and she let him walk her back toward the mess tent, without either of them naming what had shifted between the two of them somewhere in the space of that long, uncertain afternoon. Spring came slowly to the grade, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes and last from the tunnel portal's shadowed approach, and with it came the tunnel's completion, the crews breaking through to daylight on the far side of the mountain on a morning in late April that the whole camp turned out to witness, a hole of light appearing in the dark rock face, to a cheer that carried down the canyon and startled birds from trees that had only that week begun to show new growth. Su Ling stood among the crowd at the portal's edge, no longer required to keep any distance from the blast face, watching the light widen as the last charges cleared the final yards of rock, and felt an emotion she had not expected to feel toward a tunnel that had begun, in her memory, as a symbol of the debt that brought her to this canyon in the first place, something closer to pride than relief, the particular pride of having helped build a thing that would outlast every man and woman who had labored on it. Doyle found her in the crowd and did not need to say anything for her to understand, from the way he stood beside her rather than among his crew bosses, that he wanted her specifically to be there when the tunnel finally opened, a small courtesy that had become, over 5 months, an entirely unremarkable pattern between them, though its meaning had deepened well past what either of them had originally intended it to carry. The company's district superintendent arrived within the week to inspect the completed heading, and in the formal report he filed afterward, a copy of which Doyle showed her weeks later with something between pride and vindication in his voice, Camp 9's tunnel was noted as one of the cleanest and most efficiently blasted headings on that stretch of the grade, completed under budget and without the loss of life that had plagued comparable tunnels elsewhere on the line, a result the report attributed, in language considerably more generous than company reports typically extended to Chinese laborers, to exceptional powder management, and in a single specific line that Su Ling read 3 times before she trusted it, to a blasting method contributed by camp personnel that other crews on the grade would be advised to study. She had not expected her name to appear anywhere in a company document, and it did not directly, but the acknowledgement existed regardless, a formal record that something she had known and carried across an ocean had proven itself indispensable to a mountain the whole company had once doubted could be tunneled at all, and she folded that knowledge alongside the scrap of paper and the red wedding cloth still kept in her sleeve lining, one more thing worth keeping close. With the tunnel complete, Camp 9's purpose began to dissolve the way every railroad camp's purpose eventually dissolved, the blast crews reassigned to headings further along the grade, the supply depot scaled back, the company preparing to move its operation east toward the next unfinished stretch of mountain, a transition that raised, for the first time since November, the question of what would become of a contract that had specified 2 years of labor at a camp that no longer, in its original form, existed. Su Ling's debt, calculated against the wage Doyle had ensured she was paid honestly for her cooking and her ledger work, a wage considerably higher than the labor contractor's original terms had specified because Doyle had renegotiated it privately with the district office months earlier without telling her until the paperwork was already settled, stood nearly cleared, a fact the company clerk confirmed when he processed the camp's final accounts before the move east. She had expected, when the debt cleared, to feel the particular relief of a burden finally set down, and she did feel that, standing outside the company's store, reading the settled figure in the clerk's neat hand. But beneath the relief sat a harder question she had been avoiding through the whole long winter, the question of where a free woman with a cleared debt and no family left to return to was meant to go next, whether the answer was Sacramento, where a Chinese community at least offered the comfort of a shared language, or somewhere else entirely that she had not yet permitted herself to name. Doyle raised the question himself before she had fully worked up the courage to raise it on her own, finding her at the powder shed on her last scheduled evening of ledger work, and saying, with less of his usual careful composure than she had ever seen him show, that the company was assigning him to oversee the next camp east, a 2-day ride further into the mountains, and that he did not want to make that ride without knowing whether she intended to come with him, not as a contracted cook bound by any paper, but as whatever she wanted to be to him, a question he left deliberately unspecific because he told her, plainly, that the specifics were hers to name if she wanted them named at all. Su Ling stood in the powder shed doorway with the ledger still in her hands, the same shed where she had first understood, on her very first night in this canyon, that the tunnel's failures were not bad luck at all, and found that she did not have an answer ready, not because she doubted what she felt, but because no one had ever, in her whole life before this canyon, asked her to choose her own next place rather than simply telling her where she would go. She did not answer him that evening, and Doyle, to his credit, did not press her, only said that the offer would still stand whenever she was ready to give it whatever shape she chose, and left her alone in the powder shed with the ledger and the settling dusk to think through a decision that felt larger than any she had faced since the transfer paper first changed hands in November. She thought, standing there, of her grandmother's jade pendant and what it had meant to carry a piece of home across an ocean without any promise of ever returning to the place it came from, and she understood, turning the pendant between her fingers in the fading light, that the question Doyle had asked her was not really about geography at all, not about Sacramento or the next camp east, but about whether she was willing to build something new in a place that had once treated her as cargo and had, slowly, through a tunnel and a theft and a sheriff's false accusation and 100 small, unremarkable evenings, come to treat her instead as someone whose judgment on a mountain's rock and a camp's welfare mattered as much as any man's. She thought too of Rourke, who had never fully softened but who had, in the sheriff's store, given testimony that cost him something to give, and of Petrov, who trusted her arithmetic now the way he trusted his own hands, and of Auntie Feng, who had begun teaching her, in the spare hours between meals, An older widow's accumulated wisdom about camp medicine that went beyond even what her grandmother had taught her. And she understood that whatever Camp 9 had been in November, hostile and transactional and indifferent to her name, it had also become, without either of them quite planning it, a place where she had built something that belonged to her as much as to anyone, a reputation earned rather than assigned, a set of relationships forged in specific tested moments rather than granted by any paper. She found Doyle the next morning at the tunnel portal, where he had gone to oversee the final inventory before the camp's move east, and she told him, in English that had traveled a very long way since the halting sentences of her first week, that she would come east with him, not because the debt required it and not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had decided, deliberately and with her eyes open, that the life worth building was the one she chose rather than the one assigned to her, and that she chose this one, this man, this uncertain mountain camp still waiting to be named, with the same clear-eyed deliberation she had once brought to correcting a careless ledger. The camp's reaction to the news, once it spread the way all news spread through a mining outpost, faster than any official announcement, was neither the uniform scandal it might have been in November, nor the uncomplicated celebration Su Ling might once have hoped for, but something more honest than either, a mixture of genuine goodwill from those who had come to respect her specifically, and a lingering, unresolved discomfort from those who had never fully abandoned the assumptions they arrived with. A discomfort that expressed itself now not in open hostility, but in a kind of careful, polite distance that Su Ling recognized as its own form of concession. Men who would not have spoken against Doyle's choice aloud, but who also did not quite know how to celebrate it either. Rourke fell into neither camp cleanly, offering Doyle a stiff, wordless handshake on the morning the camp broke down its tents for the move east, a gesture that acknowledged the outcome without endorsing it, and Su Ling understood that this particular incompleteness, this refusal to resolve into either full acceptance or open rejection, was likely the most honest response the whole affair could produce from a man who had lost as much to circumstance as she had, even if the circumstances bore no true resemblance to each other. Auntie Feng, who was staying behind at Camp 9's site to work for whatever skeleton crew the company left to maintain the completed tunnel, gave Su Ling her own recipe book on the last evening, a cloth-bound collection of dishes stretched thin through 2 famines and 1 ocean crossing, telling her, in the blunt, affectionate manner she had used since Su Ling's first day, that a woman heading into an unfinished camp with a man who trusted her judgment would need to feed more than one appetite if she meant to keep both the camp and the man satisfied through whatever came next. Su Ling packed the recipe book alongside her mother's herb chest and her grandmother's pendant and the folded scrap of paper, worn soft now from months in her sleeve lining, that had once recorded 10 missing powder crates and had become, somewhere in the intervening months, less a piece of evidence than a private reminder of the moment she first understood that this canyon's rules could be challenged and beaten on their own terms. The wagon that would carry the camp's remaining supplies east was loaded by mid-morning, and Su Ling climbed onto its bench beside Doyle with a composure that masked, only partially, the considerable distance between the frightened, cataloging woman who had counted 41 tents in the gray dark of her first morning, and the woman who now rode east toward an unnamed camp entirely by her own choosing. The new camp, when they reached it after 2 days on a trail still soft with spring mud, was rougher than Camp 9 had been at its start. A scattering of half-raised tents and a tunnel heading barely begun, the kind of place that offered nothing yet except the promise of hard work and uncertain company. And Su Ling walked its perimeter on her first evening there the same way she had walked Camp 9's perimeter 7 months earlier, counting tents and cook fires and gauging the shape of a place she would need to understand before she could survive it. But the counting felt different this time, she realized partway through the circuit, no longer the anxious cataloging of a woman bracing against an unknown danger, but the practiced assessment of someone who had already proven, in one canyon, that she could read a camp's true weaknesses faster than the camp itself could name them, and who arrived at this new place not as cargo delivered against a debt, but as a woman whose judgment a foreman had specifically requested at his side. Doyle introduced her to the new crew bosses not as his cook, though she would certainly cook, and not as a contracted laborer working off a paper, but simply by her name, spoken correctly on the first try because he had spent 7 months learning to say it right, and by a brief, unembellished account of what she had accomplished at Camp 9, the ledger, the roof, the blast charge, the sheriff's accusation answered by a camp's own testimony, delivered not as a boast but as the plain relevant information a new crew needed to understand who was joining their operation. The new crew bosses received this introduction with the particular skepticism of men who had not yet been given reason to trust anyone, the same skepticism Doyle himself had shown her in November, before a leaking roof and a careless ledger changed his mind, and Su Ling understood, setting her mother's herb chest down inside the tent that would be hers, that she would have to prove herself again in this new place exactly as she had proven herself in the old one. That reputation traveled only so far on a mountain grade before it required fresh evidence, and that she was, if anything, more prepared for that proving now than she had been the first time, carrying not just her grandmother's knowledge and her father's arithmetic, but the accumulated, tested confidence of a woman who had already won one canyon's respect the hard way, and knew, with a certainty November's frightened cataloging woman could not have claimed, exactly how to win another. It took the new camp less than a season to learn what Camp 9 had taken all winter to accept, partly because Su Ling no longer waited for a crisis to prove her worth, but offered it plainly from the first week, correcting a powder count on her third day before it could become a 6-week discrepancy, treating a mule packer's infected hand before it could cost him the arm, and partly because Doyle, this time, introduced her from the very first evening as a partner in the camp's operation, rather than allowing the camp to discover her value the slow, suspicious way Camp 9 had been forced to. By midsummer, when the new tunnel's first difficult heading arrived, a stretch of fractured shale that worried Petrov, who had transferred east with them at his own request, specifically because he trusted no one else's judgment on unstable rock. Su Ling walked the face herself, without needing anyone's permission to be there, read the fracture lines the way her father had once read a rice merchant's books for the small inconsistencies that predicted a larger failure, and proposed a charge pattern that the crew, without argument or petition, or a sheriff's suspicious visit to complicate the process, simply adopted because it was, by then, understood throughout the camp that her judgment on such matters had earned itself past the point of requiring defense. In the evenings, when the work was done and the light held long over the mountains through the short summer nights, she sat with Doyle outside the tent they now shared, and told him stories of her grandmother's village in a mixture of English and Cantonese that had become, over the months, a language entirely their own, one he understood more of with each passing week, and he told her in turn about the Ohio farm his family had lost, and neither story erased what the other had suffered, but each made the other's grief a little less solitary to carry. She still kept the folded scrap of paper from Camp 9's powder shed tucked into a small wooden box alongside her grandmother's pendant and her mother's herb chest and Auntie Feng's cloth-bound recipes, not because she needed reminding of what she had proven in that first canyon, but because she understood now, watching a new tunnel take shape under a mountain that had never asked her permission to be difficult, that every camp she would ever walk into carried the same essential test inside it, whether a place built on the assumption that she was cargo could be made, through patient, specific, undeniable competence, to understand instead exactly what she was worth. And she had learned, in the space of one hard winter, that the answer was always hers to set, charge by careful charge, the same way she had once set the one that opened a mountain nobody else in that canyon had known how to open at all.